So what I wanted to talk to you guys about today is cultivating bilingual engagement and reaching diverse communities. I'm like, okay, we can see my screen. And sorry, I'm a little behind. I didn't jump on quite as soon as I wanted to. But I guess the first thing we want to talk about just real quickly are some bilingual best practices. And and I think the best way to start with that is just to talk a little bit about limitations. I don't think you guys. So I hope you guys can see my screen. If you can't, I'll look in the chat to be sure I can update it accordingly. Some limitations that you're going to face as an organization are operational structures in your institution. Also, like having bilingual and dual language users in decision-making positions. Resourcing, for example, do you have a translator? And if you don't have any of those things, then we would suggest that you don't try to do bilingual content for bilingual communities. And we'll get to strategies in a moment. If you have a larger budget, of course, you could have probably the best media partners are going to be like your local Spanish language television station, Univision or Telemundo. And it's almost always going to be a spoken format that's going to be your best translator. And so if you have that resource or that budget available, that's great. If you are writing content to be translated, we do know that you need to stop translating from English and try to edit Spanish in Spanish. So you want to write Spanish language content for a Spanish language editor whenever possible. Another limitation that I've encountered a lot in my career is this idea of border bilingualism. So 90% of research regarding public institutions and how to reach bilingual audiences come from border communities, primarily San Diego, a little in El Paso, and some in Laredo. And what we find is that on the border, people are bilingual on a spectrum, which is kind of like a form of like high-level code switching. So what you see are people using language both in English and Spanish, or like Spanglish as it's probably commonly known, and that's not really how people in like a larger metropolitan area would use Spanish. So I just pulled like some of this quote from some of the Spanish language research, and I think this is super important that it's not just about accessing content in Spanish and speaking again to kind of like, you don't really need to use Spanish to reach that bilingual audience or have that bilingual engagement. You can do it in English, although of course having dual language capabilities would be your ideal. So why would you use Spanish or make it an institutional priority? Spanish is the second most spoken language in the world, spoken by more than 400 million people. There's 41 million native Spanish speakers here in the United States. And about half of the residents in America's 5 largest cities are dual language users. And that number, of course, is increasing over time. So I think the main idea, and I've spoken a little bit about it, but I want the key takeaway to be the rejection of this idea that you have to have content in Spanish to target a Hispanic or Latinx audience. I think one way we can think about that is transcreating versus translating. I think like a big like Fortune 100, Fortune 500 success is what Walmart did with its Super Bowl commercial this last year. So it had a English language version that displayed cities from all over the United States, and it just chose key markets. It did a Spanish language version that showed Hispanic centric communities. It was East LA, it was Segundo Barrio El Paso, Nogales. But one of the other successes is they also placed that commercial in English in Spanish majority communities, showing the bilingual. So there's a way to use representation, and I think that's a great example of how scaffolding really is the key to increasing your bilingual engagement. So scaffolding can be as simple as simplifying your content, using illustration, providing examples, vocabulary, iconography. The idea, of course, being that if you are a language learner, and probably all of you took a high school language at some point, that there's some things that you can figure out independently, like where's the bathroom? Like, can I have a glass of water? There's content that you can kind of figure out with help. Like on a social media level, that would probably be like understanding or interpreting a meme. And there's some content that's just going to be unattainable in another language. And that might be like reading a book or a white paper. A lot of the thought leadership that's done is going to fall into that categorical. A lot of scaffolding comes down to an audience awareness. And this might feel like a thanks for the reminder. And for those of you, and I'm going to speak from an NPO government perspective, but for those of you that like are working on curatorial scholarship, thought leadership, especially like from an education academic standpoint in higher ed, like one kind of anecdotal story is I was on a team at the University of Arizona, and we were talking about how to do this exactly. We were going to Hispanic serving as an institution. And I remember saying, you know, guys, this isn't rocket scientists. And I was sitting next to a NASA engineer, and he said, actually, Clara, it is. And like, it's just thinking about who you're talking to, who you're having that conversation with. Now I'm partnering to a brain surgeon, and that's actually not a funny joke either anymore. So I want to talk, like, so if we come back to scaffolding real quick, some simple, like a lot of this has to do with your online to offline as well. Like one example when I was at the Tucson Zoo is we had semicolons and interpretive signage, and we were 60 miles from the US-Mexico border. Not only is that like hard, so really when you're talking about scaffolding, you're utilizing a universal design perspective across all your content mediums. Not only is a semicolon sentence hard for like a second grader to read, it's hard for a dual language learner to interpret. When I think about illustration, we have an exhibition right now at the Dallas Museum of Art that you can actually view in VR or a virtual tour at speechless.dma.org. And the entire exhibition kind of deals with this idea of like how to communicate without language, and they did a beautiful job of representing the exhibition through iconography. So there's a lot of video, there's a lot of pictures on how do I do this, how do I interact, and how do I participate. And again, just applying those universal design principles. Another one of my favorite examples from a vocabulary perspective is we had at one of my zoos, we had a campaign to like, we got new meerkats, and the idea was to join the mob and become a zoo member. So meerkat in Spanish is suricata, but obviously mob didn't translate quite as well. So you have to kind of think about what language you're going to use, and like, do those words make sense in both languages? I think listo in Spanish is a good example of how that code switching, or how trying to think in Spanish first instead of English first and translating makes the best sense. So if you think of listo, which is slang, what means like ready, let's go. But literally it translates as list or ledger, or as a verb, it translates as smart. So just knowing what words you're using and what they mean to people can help with like thinking about being in both languages and like kind of practicing code switching from a marketing perspective. So like why we would use those scaffolds like code switching is we're going to increase language learning. And again, as a nonprofit, as a higher ed, but even as a brand, like you're going to find a deeper connection to your audience when you're facilitating learning principles. When you're thinking about funneling and you get to that middle of funnel, being able to provide any type of learning is going to create a deeper engagement. You also have to think about reading behavior. Well, it's much easier to think about how Spanish is spoken or what words make sense out loud. A lot of our native speakers, you have to think like literacy levels will change as you're thinking geographically. There's plenty of people in the United States prefer audio Spanish content, but are not Spanish readers. But if we're always coming from a universal design perspective and thinking about what's the most accessible for everyone in my audience, you'll have a deeper cultural connection to a Hispanic or Latinx community. So a lot of what I do from an enterprise government industry is like thinking about how I'm going to engage people who aren't necessarily going to convert, but I want to expand that audience. I want to have a deeper brand connection. In a lot of ways, when I'm thinking about those marketing funnels, engagement is my conversion point. So there's two like non-revenue, I guess, avenues that make sense for like thinking about how we're going to work with communities or audiences that aren't going to convert. And the number one is placement. So if I'm thinking about those pieces of marketing, a lot of times I don't have control of the product, but I always have control of the placement. And placement can mean a couple different things. It can mean like not just where we're doing ads, but like how we're reaching out. I think like great examples are partnering with community centers or churches. There's a lot of non-traditional ways to think about like where people naturally gather and where they're going to see content, and then placing that content potentially or ideally in a dual language capacity. I also think representation is super important. So if I'm thinking about my influencer strategy, or if I'm amplifying media, like through a media partner. I know here in Dallas, I have an ABC affiliate I work with frequently, and we do a lot of influencer marketing. And when I'm thinking about who I want to be the face of our organization, sometimes it's less about who's a verified influencer and who has a deeper community engagement, maybe at like a micro level, and who's going to be a good representative, not just of our brand, but of their community. So when I'm thinking of it tactically, like on the owned, earned, and paid side, like our own content, we're going to try to use as much dual language content as possible. I don't think you guys. On the earned, of course, that's where we're going to really be partnered heavy with your Univision, your Telemundo, but lots of times there's, especially in a community like Dallas or Tucson, certainly Los Angeles, Phoenix, where you have 40%, Houston, 40% of the market share is using Spanish language, you're going to have a more local media partner that's probably more connected on a micro community level. And that's a great place to start with earned media, especially with partner content where like maybe there's a media mix between what you're paying for and what you're earning in order to get the more meaningful engagements, more placements, thinking about those 14 impressions over your audience. One thing that I think is like clearly a win for engaging bilingual audiences is in Hispanic Latinx communities is influencer marketing. But I think when we're thinking about placement and representation, there is like a more thoughtful way to do that. And so what we want to do when we're thinking about that is check kind of our unconscious bias. So I do a lot of Hispanic Latinx community marketing nationwide, and I partner, I work on contract with some larger agencies in addition to what I do with government. And a lot of that comes from the fact I'm from El Paso, Texas. But when you look at like how people think about their world perspective, only 1 in 600 people will say they're more biased than average. And so what we're thinking about when we're thinking about microaggression and unconscious bias in relation to how we're going to place media, especially on social media, I think it's just a matter of thinking about all of the noise. So I put up this like you guys have all seen this, it's a very simplistic comms model where you're filtering through your message, but you have to remember everybody, behind every brand, there's a real human being who has like thoughts and feelings and experiences that's framing how that they're pushing out their content, whether that's a team or an individual. And every time we do that, like there are moments where bias can get in the way of what we're really trying to say. And that goes back to, and that's the same for the receiver. So if we're thinking like holistically, I think like the key takeaway, in addition to the fact you don't have to do it in Spanish, is that you really just have to care. You know, a brand can't care. This is a Seth Godin quote that I look to quite a bit, and it's only people can care. So when we're thinking about um, our benefits to the organization, whether it's a universal design approach or it's an alignment to a larger financial goal, you know, money, both money and mission, having thoughtful and meaning representations that are not cliches, that are not stereotypes, is probably the most important part of reaching and engaging with the diverse community. And I don't think like acknowledging a limitation is a bad thing. I work in the nonprofit world. I frequently am acknowledging and thinking through my budget limitations, and that doesn't make me less effective at an ad strategy. It makes me a stronger buyer of ad media. I think the other thing with microaggressions and bias is just remembering our brains take shortcuts. And so when we're processing as much information as we do, and as people who create content, we know how much is out there as we're trying to break through the noise. It's just knowing that that's happening in your brain that will help you check it. So I think I try to wrap it fast so that we'd be right on time, but I will pop back over to the chat, and I'd love to take any questions, or if there's anything I moved over too quickly. With my technical limitations, I certainly wasn't planning on having my phone and computer up, but I'm so glad that you guys could all join me.